if you can see here on the overhead, yeah, that's just kind of a quick thing that we'll do. I'll spend a little bit of time here going through some of the foundation. But before we do that, just a little bit of a quick run through. If I can get this. There we go. So for those of you not familiar, Tulip Gospel Outreach is a ministry that I've started here. It is a 501c3, so your donations are tax deductible and all that kind of stuff. But really started this a few years ago, largely inspired by the desire to reach people at Tulip time, but also got a lot of inspiration, from the Iowa State Fair outreach we did. That's kind of what gave me the vision to start this, and I had the desire to get the gospel out at Tulip time, but I didn't know how to do it until I really saw how it was done at the Iowa State Fair. So that's kind of the beginning of things here. But my organization, really looking to mobilize Christians to publicly share the gospel with unbelievers in their local community. And this is done through education, invitation, and opportunity. So you'll see through this event, we have all of that. We've got some really great speakers here coming in to educate you. We've got team leads and coaches, which is kind of the invitation piece of that, right? So seeing what others are doing, learning from that, and so on. And then the opportunity is the 250,000 people that are going to be here over this weekend. Plenty of opportunity there. So that you'll see how this all kind of fits in together with that. But that's what I'm about, and this organization ministry. And this is just so, as we talk through, Eddie is going to be the next speaker immediately after me. This is some of his bio. He's going to take us through some of the evangelism basics. Tony is going to kind of coordinate and make sure we're doing sharing sessions, and he has the closing session as well, which I've heard him talk a number of things that he's always an encouragement, there. And then we've got Dr. Jason Weil. We've got 6 different talks he's going to do through the next 3 days, beginning this afternoon at 2:30. So he's not here yet. He has books and resources in the back. We'll go through some of that, throughout the time here. But so really excited about the educational opportunities and speakers here. And now I'm just going to jump into the Pella founders' history. And I've given a little bit of history and background before in previous Tulip times. This year I'm going to focus a little bit different, but essentially the backstory to Pella. Pella was founded in 1847 by a guy named Hendrik Peter Schulte. So you'll see his name around. There's a Schulte house on the north side of the square, but he was a pastor in Holland during a time of much stress and confrontation. Previously, the church had come under state governance, right? And so these guys who were going contrary to what the king had said in the state church, received much persecution. They worked, so Henry, Schulte and others, tried to work within the system, within the church, to reform the church and fix some of the problems, and eventually saw that wasn't working, and they, started what they called the secession of 1834. So this happened over a number of years, really. Schulte is also known for the Schulte Club. He went to the University of Leiden, in the north side of Holland. And they just kind of had a Bible study, right? And it was a bunch of friends getting together, studying the Bible, speaking real about the things going on in the church, and so on. So there's a lot of things you see historically through that. But through the strife, neighbor turned against neighbor. Many were arrested, cuffed, soldiers quartered in their homes, and eventually he came to the point where he started an immigration society to America. And that's what brought him here. There was about 800. He called out and said, hey, any non-Catholic Christian that wants to immigrate to America, they started forming and things in about a year. Then they had about 800 that they came over here. Long story short, they came to settle here in Pella. There's some background there too, which I'll talk about later on why it was named Pella and so on. But they really desired freedom of worship. So as you hear, you'll hear this from various places, throughout, on the loudspeakers or in the windmills and things like that. But one of the things they really talk about is they fled Holland because they didn't have freedom of worship. So I'm going to give you a little bit of that backstory today, because a lot of times that's not dug into it as deep. Some of the information, or most of the information I got, was from this book, A Goodly Heritage, by Cornelius Pronk. It's on the secession of 1834 and its impact on reformed churches in the Netherlands and North America. But there's a ton of great information in there. I never thought I'd like a historical theology book, but because there's a tight connection here, I've really enjoyed it. But we'll talk through some of the timeline here. In 1807, the authority of, church came under the authority of the king. They introduced a new hymnal, right? So they'll say, hey, they fled because they didn't have freedom of worship because of a hymn, right? It was a simple act of the government, but it was done without church authority. So we talk about separation of church and state. They're two separate jurisdictions. But here, the church is coming in and dictating things to the church without any church authority, right? So that's a dangerous thing, right? Many viewed this as a departure from the biblical hymns, and eventually the state church, wasn't getting compliance, right? People didn't want to sing those hymns because they saw them as unbiblical. Later they made it mandatory, and that's where we started getting into arrests and all sorts of things there. But there was growing dissent from others. From some, others said, it's a small thing, we'll accept it. But it was a growing controversy. And I'll say here, it wasn't just the hymns. The hymns wasn't the only thing, right? It was around all sorts of different things within the church, around membership and baptism and all sorts of things that the state church came in with, right? So Schulte is one of the several outspoken opponents, and we're going to go into the next piece here. So Henry de Cock, most people look at that secession. The beginning of it really, going on is a pastor named Henry de Cock. He was a pastor in Ulrum. He openly opposed the hymns due to the disagreement with the canons of Dort. Canons of Dort were established during the Reformation in 1618, 1619. So in Holland, that was kind of one of the key confessions, coming out of the Reformation. He wrote articles and expressed his views. He printed them and distributed them, right? If you've been out distributing tracts before, it's kind of what he did, right? He wrote, some things here. He would print them, he'd distribute them, really, kind of stirred up, some of the things and made arguments for why he opposed them and so on. And he often, in his church services, did not sing those unbiblical hymns. At one point, the state church came in, they called him before their council, they threatened to depose him, kick him out as pastor, basically, over this and many issues. They sent a report back to the church council. The church council said, okay, well, hymnals, that's a small thing. Let's just sing the hymnals. Because we like you as a pastor, we don't want to lose you over something small like that. And they did that for a while. But eventually his conscience could not bear it anymore. He preached a sermon and explained why he would no longer baptize among members and why he could no longer sing these unbiblical hymns. The next Sunday, the state church came in. They after went through the whole service and saw they did not sing any hymns, they arrested him and took him away. Peter Schulte was a good friend of him, very familiar. Wasn't part of the Schulte Club, but he came immediately. And the next Sunday he was set to preach. He was invited by their church to preach, and he came and preached. They didn't sing any hymns. They kind of went through the whole thing again. Closed the church, put chains on the doors, and locked them out. In Holland at the time, it was very regular expectation that you have two services. You have a Sunday morning service, a Sunday evening service to close it in, and your Sabbath. So instead of just stopping that, Schulte came in that evening, and they went out in the field behind the church and preached in the open air. Didn't let any locking the church doors stop that. Soldiers were often brought in to prevent disruptions under guest preachers, so this is a little bit broader perspective too. But even to the point, it's just a hymn, right? That people were coming and threatening to burn hymnals because of their disagreement, with Scripture. Many were quartered in homes as pastors in church, both pastors and church members, at the expense of the homeowner. So imagine having 3 soldiers come in and stay at your house. You got to feed them, you got to give them room and board, everything else. It's just crazy. Let me go through a few more here, right? Because there were many, and I just picked a few out of here. Anthony Bromkamp, he was actually part of the Schulte Club, and he went through some similar things. So this is one of his quotes. He said, "I had been aware for some time already that the hymn book, which was introduced into the church in 1807, is both in spirit and in tendency in conflict with Reformed doctrine. I understood very well that by not using it, it would bring upon myself the hatred of the establishment. I thought, however, that I had to obey God." And this is a quote, him writing from prison. The state church had other concerns with some of the things there, and they were trying to figure out how to address that. But as soon as he went to the point he didn't sing hymnal, they used the hymnal issue to arrest him. Right? So when that happened, they got deposed. They were no longer ordained pastors and things like that. But many of them would continue preaching. But preaching them, because it was under the state, became illegal. He continued to do that, and he'd go different places. He'd get arrested. He'd fined. That was just kind of the part of their life as they went through this controversy. Here's another one. He was a younger pastor, and he came in. He thought, "Hey, I see this issue. I'm going to try, as had been done before, to kind of change from within." So he stopped. He wrote a letter to the classes, and if you're not familiar with the Reformed Church's structure, it's kind of a regional board where several churches in a region come together, and there's some oversight and things like that. And he wrote this letter requesting to adhere to the 3 forms of unity: Heidelberg Catechism, Belgian Confession, and Canons of Dort. And he got up and he made that passionate speech, and there was silence. And after a while, he said, "Well, silence lends consent." And then that stirred up the crowds and everything else. Later, they took a lunch break, and I think I've got some of that stuff. On his way down lunch, he overheard someone said, "I would have rather cut my throat than subscribe to the Canons of Dort." In fact, one guy pulled him aside and said, "Hey, there's some threats here against you. Watch out." Right? That was a key event. Later, he was out preaching at his church in Charlerberg. I'm not sure if I pronounced that Dutch name right, but during the worship service, he and the congregation heard the sounds of drums. soldiers marching, coming, surrounding the church. They approached with rifles and bayonets. This is one, two, they kicked him out of the church. They went over immediately to the bar. Then the soldiers found him there, and they went like 3 or 4 different places until they were finally stopped. And soldiers were quartered in his homes. In his home, someone had leaked that the soldiers there sought a plot to kill him. And it was actually the commander who stopped that from happening, because he was made aware of it and said, no, don't do this, right? I think this is the last one. Franz Geziel Mueller. To him, the hymnal issue was just as strong among members as it was, the pastors. And I would say one of the things there at his church, there was a member, and several of us kind of followed. He'd come in, take off his coat, he'd go sit down, and every time they sang one of the hymnals, he would take out his stovepipe hat and stick it on as a visual protest. Disrupts the service. The previous pastor at that church, when he did that, even called in the police to have him removed. Didn't stop him, but that's a little bit of a demonstration there. And then this is kind of related to him at the same time, but the recognition from some leaders in the state church. He said the issue was not really the hymnals. He said, we shall certainly deal with Geziel, this guy, that hypocrite. I believe with you that in the long run, the faction will rage itself to death. Those sermons in the open air will cease by themselves. For who wants to have catarrh and rheumatism, excuse me, out of the pure love for the synod of 1618 and 1619. So you see, it's not just the hymnal. And this is the last one. Lambertus Ledabor, right? While preaching one Sunday, he demonstrated his dislike for the hymnals. He picked up the hymnal, right? You can picture this, and he just threw it out in the aisle. That's the way I picture it. And someone thought, I'm going to go pick it up. He says, no, leave that there. We'll bury it later. And after the service, they did. So think about that, right? The surface level story you'll hear is that they came over here over freedom of worship, because of hymnals. You can see it is so much deeper than that.
I have a question. What about the Bible? Did you hear him preach from the Bible?
Yes.
In the book?
Yes. So that was their issue, right? They always would preach from the Bible, expository preaching and things like that. They didn't like the hymnal.
Wow.
Because it conflicted with
Their hymn.
No, the hymnal conflicted with what they were reading in Scripture. That's why it was so important to them. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, right, we see some things here. I made some references, throughout here, and the PowerPoint here is kind of different here, but the words kind of get mixed together. But what drove these men to oppose the state church? Was it really over some simple hymns, which I think I've kind of demonstrated this night? Was it freedom of worship? The king had kept the confessions of the, right, we talked about the 3 forms of unity. There's 3 different confessions they had at the time. He kept 2 of them, but he removed the canons of Dort. That confession, was a confession that's formulated in the Synod of Dort, which is held in Dordrecht, And so Dort is just short for Dordrecht. It's a city in South Holland. This map on the left, you'll see actually in the Windmill Museum. So you see where Dort was, or Dordrecht was, right? And does anybody know anything about the canons of Dort? What is their significance today, or how do we understand that? Has anybody heard the doctrines of grace? There's a few here, right? The doctrines of grace, aren't exactly the canons of Dort, but those articles was how it was formulated. It's more of a, here's our positive argument, here's how we argue against, and why these things fit with Scripture, right? So over 16, 18, 19, so this is a council of pastors and others, that lasted over a year. They worked through these issues, and that's essentially where we get the doctrines of grace today, is out of those canons of Dort. So, okay, any questions on that? That I think should give you a good history of some of the Christian foundation here in Pella. I'm going to go through some of these tracts and materials that we've got available. Right, so these are ones that are specific. I'll show you, specific to the events here at Pella. So this one, I've probably got fewer of these, but it's a longer booklet. It's 16 pages or something, but it basically takes you through the doctrines of grace. And cover photo is by my son in the back. So we've got some family ties here. This is probably one of my new favorites. I did this a couple years ago. It's called Pella's Biblical Roots. Actually, I think I can go through some of these things. Right, so Pella's Biblical Roots. The town was founded. They named the town Pella as a city of refuge, because they came out of all of that strife, which I just went through. They came to settle in America. It was a place of peace and refuge, right? So Pella is significant because historically, the historic tradition says, anybody remember in Luke when Jesus was, talking about, hey, when these things happen, flee, go to the hills, get out of Jerusalem, right? It's talking about the siege of Jerusalem. And he was instructing Christians to flee from that, right? And historically, where many of those Christians fled to when Jerusalem was sieged was to a city north of Jerusalem called Pella. It's one of the cities of the Roman Decapolis, one of the 10 important, strategic cities, and so on. So this kind of goes through a little bit about that, as well as kind of transitioning to the gospel that God calls us to flee from our sin. Let's see, I'm going to go back here. I probably do have one here. This is one that actually my wife wrote. It's a good summary of some of the story of them immigrating over and things like that, and how important Christianity, the religion was. Actually, the picture of the church on the front page is kind of an outline drawing of the church across the street. But all the street names were named after biblical ideas and independence and patience and things like that. So there's some good information in there as well. The other thing is this one. That's the big one there. This is actually a mural that it may be the size between those two pillars there, that sits inside the post office here in town. But it basically shows three scenes. You see on the left is them in Holland. You see them chained up and getting arrested and all that stuff. Then they went through, they immigrated, they came over on a ship. There's Sculte there praying over the passengers and so on, and then you see them finally settled here in Pella, church being central. So, and then there's a basic step through that, as well as a gospel call on the back as well, kind of telling the story. So these are incredibly easy to give out here because they're coming to Pella, they want information. You get them some information, and get them to gospel at the same time. So we've also got a number of $1 million bills, but there's some other tracks from Answers in Genesis around astronomy and other things too. Kind of tying in with Jason Lyle and his talks as well. So, and we've got some from Living Waters as well, some $1 million bills. And I'm trying to remember, Eddie, we have the fear. I'm trying to remember the name of that one. I don't have it up here.
How to break free from the fear of death.
Yes, How to Break Free from the Fear of Death. So that is out there as well.